Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about advanced Dungeons and Dragons and distinct from Dungeons and Dragons. And for example, like back in the day, why did TSR Hobbies decide to publish a game, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, when they already had a game, Dungeons and Dragons, that was very successful? So we might wonder why that happened. And I think that's not a simple answer. There's not a simple answer to that question. But I'm going to try to make a stab at it here. And there's a couple of reasons why this happened. So let's just remind ourselves okay, so the original Dungeons and Dragons rules are published in 1974. There are three booklets that are in a white box. Well, actually, they're not in a white box. It's a brown box with a white label on it. And then eventually that does become a fully white box in the later editions. But the original Dungeons and Dragons rules are a little bit obscure in various places. They don't have, for example, really a combat system that's very detailed. It doesn't really tell you any procedures about that. They expect that you're a miniature wargamer and that you're going to have available to you some kind of rules that you could use to resolve these things. They do recommend getting the chainmail rules, like for example. And there is an alternate combat system that's included in the rulebook that is just really a one chart, and then it tells you roll a d6 for damage. And that chart actually does become kind of what we know now as the D&D combat system. That's the system, we roll a d20 and we try and figure out, and then we see if we roll high enough to hit versus somebody's armor class. That's basically the D&D combat system, and that is what was in the original Dungeons and Dragons called the alternate combat system. But there's no rules about initiative, like who goes first, or how very much of this is supposed to happen. And what that meant is that the game was very open to house ruling, meaning that individual people running the game, who were originally called referees, each referee would kind of have his own kind of sort of set of house rules and things that that he was really encouraged to develop by the rules. And in fact, like very much at the end of the rule book, it says this. There's also a lot of sort of supporting sort of anecdotes that people have sort of talked about, that literally people would have rules questions about the original Dungeons and Dragons rules. They sometimes they'd find out, okay, this guy Gygax lives in Lake Geneva. Let's call information. And at least at some point in the 1970s, you could actually just get Gary Gygax's phone number from information, and people would sometimes just call him on the phone, and so they would call him and then ask him questions about the rules. And this started to happen more and more as time went on, because they saw that they had questions, and they were like, hey, I'm going to call the guy who was the co-author of the game. Remember, him and Dave Arneson had originally written the rules. So at that time, apparently, Gary's response to a lot of these calls was he would listen to the person. They'd say, well, here's like our question. And then Gary would ask them, well, how did you guys actually resolve it at the table, like in the moment? Like, what did you do? And they'd say, well, we just did this, but we had a question about the rule. And then Gary would stop and he'd think about that and he'd go, well, that sounds pretty good to me. Meaning that he was sort of saying that, well, your answer, right, that you came up with is maybe as good as my answer is going to be. So my answer may not be the same as yours, but yours is, that sounds good. And it suggests something, that the idea that your ideas about a referee, being a referee kind of also makes you a designer. That like you also are kind of a game designer, and it's okay for you to then change this game, especially if those changes are going to make the experience for you and your players more enjoyable. that's ultimately the root of that kind of thinking. Um, and that was really what shaped Gary in the original D&D. And what he was thinking was that this will be a toolbox. People will be able to have these magnificent fantasy adventures, and they're going to just use this box as a way to sort of jump off into that. And wherever they go, we're not going to dictate to them where they should go or how they should do it. And that's, I think, the promise of the original Dungeons and Dragons box. It provided a way for people to just follow their imaginations, and they did. The problem with that, though, this is only a problem from a certain perspective, but you'll see when I get to talking about this where, from TSR's perspective, this becomes a problem. That suddenly you've got all these different people running these games and maybe creating their own sort of versions of the combat system, doing their own versions of like how initiative works, doing their own versions of like, okay, well, I've added more spells, or I've added new character classes, or in my game you can play, orcs, and in my game you can play, vampires, and in my game, one of my characters is a werewolf, and one of my players is a dragon in my game, and and just suddenly you had all sorts of crazy stuff happening because Gary basically says, hey, you can kind of do whatever you want with this. And this is very much encouraged by the original box set. Like it definitely sort of pushes you to sort of do this on your own. But what happened was is they started then selling this, and then people were coming to them, and they were saying, "Hey, um, we'd like to run games at a tournament, or we'd like to have a tournament, a Dungeons and Dragons tournament," and they started running these at conventions. Okay, so you started running tournaments of Dungeons and Dragons players, but that's a real problem when you've got everybody having a slightly different interpretation of the rules or different procedures that they've developed for initiative or whatever it is. And so there's not a lot of agreement then on what the rules are, right? And if that happens, then you really can't have a tournament very effectively. I guess you can say, hey, here are the tournament rules we're using, uh, and these are the rules, and I guess everybody could agree to that, but you're still going to get a lot of confusion, right? And so they were realizing also that there were people who are playing something that might have been called Dungeons and Dragons, but the reality is that probably, even though it was called Dungeons and Dragons, it may not bear a lot of resemblance to even the bare minimum of things that were in the box to begin with, because who knows where this person had taken the game, right? So the game was being played in all sorts of different ways, and people had very different interpretations about how it was going to be run. Sometimes, I mean, I think there was a lot of people who were within a certain zone of each other, but I do think that that there was so much variation, it became daunting to TSR to even be able to talk to this base of people, and they had also kind of missed the boat because there was a company called Judges Guild who was making a lot of money selling supplements and specifically adventures for Dungeons and Dragons, which they hadn't thought of really. Like Gary didn't think that like people would want him to supply them adventures, right? He assumed that people would just make up their own stuff. That was what the game was for, right? So why would you want us to supply you your fantasy, adventure? Why not just develop that on your own? And that was definitely what was intended initially. But eventually they said, hey, we need to get into this market too. So they started developing modules. Gary started developing modules like the Giant series, and the D series, and the Tomb of Horrors, and a whole series of these sort of early 1970s modules. This is really the classic Gary Gygax modules. He really, really sort of has this golden age of module writing from like 1977 to about 1979, 1980, somewhere in there. And it's like that, those 3 years, he's incredibly productive. And his modules are really, really interesting and innovative. And in many ways, those modules are what taught people really how to play the game. Those modules, though, were being developed not for original Dungeons and Dragons, by and large. There's almost no modules for the original D&D box. There's in the Blackmore supplement. There's the Temple of the Frog, which is kind of an adventure, which is written by Dave Arneson. But and then we have the basic set, which comes out in '77, which I've talked about elsewhere. But why did they come up with AD&D then? Well, it ties into all the stuff I was just talking about because they were wanting to run tournaments, and they realized that they wanted to have um, a place where they could go to a sort of official, like, let's actually create a more solid and robust rule set that people can actually refer to that has actually filled in some of these gaps. Okay, so we're not going to leave things as obscure or as open as we did in the original box. We're gonna actually fill in those blanks for you and give you more procedures on how to play, because this is, by that point, a lot of people had come to them and told them that's what they wanted. And they also realized they could sell more books to these people because by this point, TSR was also becoming a business. And that's one of the things businesses have to do. I think Gary may have initially just thought, like, we're going to publish this game, it'll people will buy it, and then maybe we'll just move on to doing other games, right? We'll be a game company. That's what we do. You wouldn't think necessarily that the company would become so focused around one singular game and all of the potential products that could be sort of directed at that. And TSR did develop other games. That's true. They did board games and they did other role playing games, but D&D was their bread and butter, right? That was the thing that was making the company its real money. And they kind of knew that at a certain point that D&D was the thing. That's what people wanted, right? So Gary's like, okay, fine. I'm going to revise the rules, and we're also going to put them in a deluxe format. Okay, we're going to put them in these nice hardbacks. I will expand the rules so they're going to be more expansive. I'm going to go into great detail about things I think that people have asked me about. So, like, all these sort of ideas he's had for possible expansions are kind of brewing in his head, and he decides, okay, let's do this. And also, this is going to be solely authored by Gary. So Dave Arneson helped conceive the idea of the original box, helped come up with the very idea of role playing, or developed the idea of fantasy role playing with Gary. Dave's really the person who's the origin point in some ways. But Gary then takes that and develops it. But now Gary's going to do this alone, right? Because him and Dave have had a little bit of a falling out by this point. And so Gary's going to go into the advanced D&D project by himself. Some people have suggested that, and I don't know how true this is, but I've certainly seen this rumor sort of talked about online, which is that one of the reasons they did the advanced D&D books was some kind of legal coverage. I don't know that that's actually the case. It certainly freed Gary, though, to not have to worry about Dave, because this was his version of the game, basically. This is Gygaxian D&D, basically. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is really what you're looking at here. Gygaxian is that's a word we have now. It tells you something. Anyway, but so Gary also was going to take this opportunity to consolidate everything that had been spread over a bunch of supplements, basically. Because in the other OD&D supplements, you had things like the Thief class, the Druid class, the Assassin class, the Monk class. All of these classes had been introduced. And then later on, you had, and the Paladin as well. And then the Ranger was introduced in Dragon Magazine, and as well as the Bard, right? All of those were introduced in these other supplements. And so the idea was, let's pull this all together into one comprehensible book. We're going to put everything in there. We're going to add more spells. I'll take the opportunity to change things around. I'm going to consolidate the combat rules, make that more clear, and that's how we got Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Um, the other side to this, though, so in that we get the first of all we get the player's handbook, right? Published. Actually, no, I'm sorry. First of all, we get the monster manual, which made sense to start with that because Gary said it was easy to work on the monster manual because he could just do individual entries for the monsters and just work on them kind of piecemeal, and eventually it grew into this giant book because he was doing these more elaborate entries for all the monsters. So all the monsters that are in OD&D are here in the monster manual. Some of them are changed actually a little bit, but all the monsters are there, and then he adds a lot more. Plus, there were monsters in the supplements, and he consolidates all those into one book. So, again, you're consolidating all of this material that was spread out over different things into one sort of publication. So, that happens with the Monster Manual. And then the same is true for the Player's Handbook, right? So we start with the Monster Manual, 77, Player's Handbook, 78, so a year later. And so now all the players' information is consolidated in the player's handbook. You've got everything you need to run the game. So if you've got your player's handbook and you've got your monsters manual, you've got everything consolidated. What he hadn't really done, though, is that what everybody was waiting for was the combat system and all the rules and procedures that the game master was supposed to be doing. So until 1979, everybody was still kind of using the original white box to sort of do that stuff. Or they were relying on things like the Holmes Basic set, or sort of extrapolations of the Holmes Basic set, or the attack tables that maybe had been printed in a year before in Dragon magazine. And so people were relying on this other stuff in order to sort of make their games playable, but they really needed the information that Gary had to give them for really a lot of the real procedural stuff that the game was going to tell you how to do. And so that finally came to a culmination in 1979 with maybe the ultimate Dungeons and Dragons book, the ultimate Gygaxian tome, which is the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is just a kind of mad, brilliant piece of work that is just full of so much crazy stuff. All this stuff Gary had been thinking about, he just threw it into the Dungeon Master's Guide. So there's like, sections on like herbs and things like that, like why you would need to know that, but like suddenly it's like this giant pages lists of like herbs and like what they do and things like that. And then there's like randomly generated dungeons that you can create. There's all sorts of encounter tables, giant lists of magic items and special magical artifacts, and which some of this stuff had been in the supplements, but he pours it all in here. There's a lot more extensive rules about hirelings, about employing men at arms and things like that, building castles and fortresses, all sorts of stuff like this, and it becomes a really much more elaborate sort of toolbox than even OD&D was. But the idea is that it's less confusing, and that we can use this now, right, for our tournaments and whatnot. But I don't know that was. I'm not sure that was exactly like. I mean, they did do that, and certainly there is. What was interesting is that while they did solve some problems, the way the Dungeon Master's Guide is written and the way the rules are written, in some ways, is also kind of confusing. So there are some bits of the combat procedure, for example, the initiative system, that I think people did have a little bit of trouble getting their heads around. And I think that as a result of that, that meant that people were not going to be, people were going to be still house ruling this a lot. They were going to be simplifying things. They were going to be basically using sometimes a lot of the rules from the basic rules, and then just carrying those rules over to the advanced D&D without really paying close attention, or closely reading what advanced D&D actually says about those things. And sometimes AD&D does things very differently. Gary clearly has a certain way of approaching the game, and I think that some people, and it's a different way in some ways, more prescriptive than the way he talked about in OD&D. He still has like, hey, make this your own. This is your game. You're now the dungeon master. You're not a referee anymore. You're a dungeon master. And that's the terminology change. They sort of created their own terminologies, right, for this now. Like, what are you doing? And so that was interesting. That this came about also partly because of the commercial side of this, because there was Gary the gamer, who's the guy who created the box set and thought, hey, this is really neat. Let's share this with people, and maybe we can make some money on it too. But then there's Gary the businessman, who now is several years into this, and now he's like got all these employees, and there's people working for him, and the company's getting bigger and bigger, and they're making more and more money, which was great. But also that meant that there was competition now also too. Suddenly they weren't the only people making fantasy role playing games, and Gary was worried, that they were going to get out competed. So he wanted to basically he had an edge on everybody else because like we got the big game in the market, right? So let's keep our edge. And the way we do that is by having a product that's better than everybody else's product. Well, certainly the format of this, I mean, there was nothing like this in the gaming world in 1977 when this came out. This hardback book, you know. It had a kind of also I think one thing Gary was thinking practically too, the idea that hey man, these books are going to go through a lot of wear and tear. People are going to be using these a lot. They're meant to be used, and so they have to be durable, and they are. I mean, these are my these are like original copies, and my copies are still holding together pretty good. Granted, some people's I've heard people's books do fall apart sometimes, but uh, but yeah, I've had this Dungeon Master's Guide since like 1981, I think. No, 82. I think 82. So I've had that since 1982, and it still is a pretty good book. I mean, it's not in pristine shape, but considering all the wear and tear it's been through, still holding up pretty well. So in that sense, they did right. They did the right thing. Um, but anyway, I feel like I'm just rambling now, so I might go ahead and call it there. But those are a lot of the reasons, basically, why they created Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So hopefully this was insightful or interesting to you. I'm not sure how interesting this is to anybody, but that's okay. If you're not interested, don't watch. So, well, I shouldn't be saying this at the end of the video, probably because if you've gotten to the end of the video, you've probably already watched everything. But anyway, all right. So great. Thanks everybody, and I'll be back next time.